I'm Kelly Jennings, CEO of PowerBand Solutions. PowerBand is a cloud-based provider of auction, inventory, and finance solutions that make buying, selling, and financing vehicles more efficient. PowerBand Solutions trades on the TSX Venture Exchange symbol PBX and on the OTCQB symbol PWWPF and on Frankfurt symbol 1ZV. For more information, please visit us at powerbandsolutions.com.
You're listening to HowStreet.com radio, available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. Welcome to HowStreet.com radio, the online source for market opinions. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is James Corbett, publisher of the CorbettReport.com and editorial writer for the International Forecaster. He's speaking to us from Japan, where he has worked and lived since 2004. Welcome back to the show, James.
Thanks for having me back on, Jim. Always a pleasure to be here.
Typhoons rolling through Japan, China, Taiwan, the Philippines. Are you okay, and how are folks there reacting?
Yes, well, myself and my family are okay, but unfortunately a lot of other people aren't. And there, even here in Japan, where people might have seen there was a big typhoon came through a couple of weeks ago, they're still dealing with the after effects of that in Osaka, where it was heavily bombarded, of obviously one of the major metropolitan centers in Japan, and even the major international airport, the Kansai airport, was flooded out, and lots of flights canceled, and they're still dealing with the cleanup from that. So that has greatly affected us. And then, of course, as people have seen in the last week or so, the latest typhoon went straight through the Philippines and then into Hong Kong and China. So unfortunately, just another active typhoon season over here on this side of the globe. And of course, no stranger to people on the other side of the globe where it's hurricane season. So it's just one of those things that that happens every year around this time.
Do they have any long-range forecasts on what the weather situation is going to be like for Asia this year?
I haven't seen anything about this coming winter, but I have a feeling it's going to be a particularly cold one. We had, as people might have seen, a record-breaking heat wave here in Japan this summer, and it was uncomfortably hot for a very long time. There was a lot of deaths that resulted from it, a lot of heat stroke. Even my own friend succumbed to the heat stroke, so that was horrible. After, of course, the major flooding that happened here a couple of months ago, it's been nonstop disaster. So I'm bracing for a harsh winter.
Yes, as they say, may you live in interesting times. China's ongoing tariff war with the U.S., China now threatening $60 billion in tariffs, the U.S. countering with $200 billion. Is this thing going to end, and can China withstand it, or the U.S., who will blink first?
Well, I think that's an interesting question, because China is obviously, as an export-dependent nation, is hurting from this, and that's obviously the point of this. And so the idea is to get them to blink first. But if they can resist this short-term pressure, in the long term, things start to turn towards China's benefit, in the sense that, at any rate, if China views the U.S. as an adversary rather than a partner in global trade, then they will start to structure their exports and their economy towards that end, as they already have in recent years. We've talked about them trying to steer the economy more towards domestic dependence rather than export dependence. But of course, now with the development of the global $1 trillion Silk Highway benefit infrastructure plan that they have ongoing, that, of course, was always directed at diversifying away from the U.S. as their sole dependent export nation. And it's already made considerable progress. Not enough to really counteract the effects of this trade war, however. So I think in the long term, China is positioning itself to rely less on the U.S. markets, but it's a question, can it survive through this short-term pain to get to that long-term picture? And that is a very big question. The other factor in all of this, of course, though, is that it is not just the Chinese who are hurting from this, it's U.S. corporations themselves. And the latest headlines say that the trade tensions, this round of trade spat, has affected 73% of U.S. companies with a presence in China, including, of course, the big ones like Apple and GM. So there is definitely a shooting your own foot kind of thing going on here, where U.S. companies are going to be affected by this quite a bit as well.
U.S. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross says China is now out of bullets to retaliate. But what if they cut off rare earth shipments to the U.S.?
Yes, I think it's obviously true that China cannot really retaliate with tariffs in the same way that the U.S. can, simply because they do not export as much to they do not import as much from the U.S. as the U.S. imports from China, so they don't really have that trigger to pull. But they have other triggers. As you suggest, it could be such things as the fact that China has cornered rare earth minerals and other markets like that in recent years, and they could use that type of leverage. Or, of course, there's always currency devaluation, which China has always been accused for several years of doing to basically increase their trade advantage with the U.S. Well, they could engage in that wholesale and really go whole hog and really start to devalue their currency, and that would, of course, change the balance as well. So, yes, they cannot really retaliate with dollar-for-dollar trade tariffs, but they can retaliate in other ways.
Could the Chinese government simply order its citizens not to buy anything American?
They certainly could, and I don't think anyone would put that past the Chinese government to do something like that, because, of course, the Chinese Communist Party does strictly control what its population is and is not allowed to do. So it's certainly possible that we would see some sort of official boycott of U.S. goods. But then again, as we say, China doesn't import a whole lot from the U.S., and the things that it does import tend to be higher end goods that does not affect the general population so much anyway.
What about China focusing its retaliation on people like American farmers who've had their market for soybeans, for example, cut off?
Yes, again, I think this is what we're seeing right now is largely directed towards industrial concerns, but agriculture remains, I think, an important part of the American economy and is generally one of those sticking points in a lot of the global trade agreements we've seen over the past few decades. It always comes back down to agriculture and agricultural subsidies. And again, this is an area in which China has the potential to be able to do some damage. And certainly we have already started to see some negative impact on soybean farmers and others in the U.S. So it's another leverage point that could be used. And especially if this trade war spreads out. Obviously, the U.S. doesn't have great relations with any of its neighbors right now, certainly as you know in Canada or Mexico, as they're trying to renegotiate NAFTA and all of this. The U.S. is vulnerable on a number of different fronts. If any of these fronts came together or started to act in unison, I think there could be considerable damage, especially to the U.S. agricultural markets.
China's prime minister says, quote, "We're facing greater difficulties in the economy." What would those difficulties be? The tariffs or something else?
I think the tariffs would be the prime driving factor of those difficulties, and everything else would be shakeout from it. Although, interestingly, I don't know what to make of this, but Asian stocks at the moment, you would expect them to be plummeting. Well, they're mixed, if anything. And in fact, the Nikkei here in Japan has just hit an 8-month high, based on the fact that the tariffs that were just leveled, although they are by far the biggest that have been leveled so far, are in fact not as much as some traders were expecting. So it's one of those things where, well, it could have been worse, is actually driving stocks up. So there's a number of ways in which this can play out that it isn't necessarily disastrous, but I think for China specifically, this has to be front and center because, as we say, I mean, this is such a heavily export-dependent economy that at this point, any disruption of that will definitely have knock-on effects throughout the Chinese economy. And we see this in the way that I think the type of rhetoric that's coming out of Beijing right now. I've seen statements to the effect that they hope that America will realize the error of their ways quickly and reverse course because they don't want to upset the global trade order, which was an actual quote from a Chinese representative in the last couple of days. And I think that's essentially China's big leverage here is the threat to destabilization of the global trade order, because as we all know, in the last decade or two, that global trade order has been dominated by China, and Chinese economic growth has been the portent for global economic growth over the past decade or two. And so I think they've got a gun to the head of the global economy if they should disrupt that and disrupt the global trade order, as they call it.
Again, would that see everybody else gang up on the U.S. if they're not happy with American tariffs?
It really depends on which way that shakes out. I think at this point, I mean, what we saw, obviously, from the recent G7 summit, yeah, I think it seems that Donald Trump is fighting a one-man war against basically the rest of the world, and even his allies and staunchest partners and even neighbors are not happy with the way that the U.S. is going. So it really could eventuate into some sort of trade war against the U.S. in particular. And it doesn't necessarily have to go that way. But if it did, as I say, there's a lot of ways in which America's largest trading partners and its closest trading partner, like Canada, could really inflict some damage if they were looking to do so.
Could China target U.S.-owned casinos in Macau?
Yes, absolutely. That's one of the things. Although, of course, that brings in the sort of diplomatic and greater political situation of China and its control over the areas that it claims control over, but maybe doesn't necessarily exert control over to the extent that they claim, including Macau, including Hong Kong, including, obviously, Taiwan. And on that note, I did just see that apparently the Vatican is going to be sending a delegation to China in the coming weeks. The Vatican being one of the few places on the planet that still does not recognize China diplomatically, because obviously they recognize Taiwan. So that is a potential development towards maybe something approaching Chinese rapprochement with the Vatican, although they are saying that this will only be based on religious matters and they won't be discussing diplomatic situations. But I think even just sending a delegation is in and of itself important. And of course, again, this relates to areas like Macau that, again, are somewhat under the control of China, but or at least on paper, but maybe not in reality. And if they did start exerting control, that would bring in the big diplomatic situation and potentially, yes, affect U.S. investors in casinos and other things there.
We'll have more with James Corbett right after the break.
I'm Brian Fowler, president of Blind Creek Resources Limited, listed on the TSX Venture Exchange, ticker symbol BCK. Blind Creek is focused in the Yukon, Northwest Territories, and British Columbia. The company's key property is the Blend Project, one of the largest undeveloped lead zinc silver deposits in Western Canada, plus plans to advance the recently acquired, fully permitted historic engineered gold mine in the Atlan district of northwestern BC. Check us out at blindcreekresources.com.
I'm Douglas Mason, CEO of Naturally Splendid, symbol NSP on the TSX Venture Exchange. Naturally Splendid is a biotechnology and consumer products company focused on the global cannabis and health markets. Naturally Splendid is expanding distribution in this rapidly growing market with products currently in Canada, the USA, South Korea, Germany, and Australia. To view our comprehensive company presentation and for more information, please visit our website at naturallysplendid.com.
Welcome back. We're speaking with James Corbett. James, anything big coming out of the World Economic Forum in Tianjin?
I'll let you know. I haven't seen anything floating across my radar anyway, but one tends to think of these things as a talking shop, and generally for things that have already been decided at higher levels. So we'll see what filters through this. The only thing that I've seen so far is that there's been talk about Chinese tech regulation has been one of the things that they've talked about at that forum, and that's certainly interesting given where we are, not only economically speaking, but in terms of scientific development, and obviously China positioning itself to aspirationally. President for Life Xi has talked about wanting China to be the world leader in AI technologies and other emerging technologies by 2030, and there's a considerable effort on that ongoing right now. So, of course, the question of tech regulation and what that means, not only for international investment, but also just for the technology itself, and these types of potentially very disruptive technologies like AI and autonomous robots and killer robots and things like that, as Putin and others have pointed out, whoever becomes the leader in that will really be the ruler of the world in the coming decades. And I think we should take that talk very seriously, because these technologies are already starting to happen, and they're happening in places like China more so than the U.S. right now. And I think that's why the World Economic Forum is so interested in
has China's economy turned from a boom to a bust yet, or are they just trying to hold on?
Well, it certainly hasn't. It certainly isn't booming anymore, as you would imagine. But at this point, I think we're still yet to see what the ultimate effects of the tariffs are going to be, economically speaking. As we talked about last time, we have seen some belt tightening happening among the Chinese population, who have been using some of the free credit money that's been sloshing around the Chinese economy, thanks to the People's Bank of China in the last several years. That's been going into the shadow banking industry and some very exotic financial instruments, because people were happy to play with 10 or 15% returns, even if they weren't the most stable returns. Well, people are turning more towards to conventional banking savings and 2% returns, because they are getting more worried about the situation. And I think that belt tightening is obviously a sign that there's already an awareness of what's going on in China. But again, often manufacturing and things like that are several months in advance of what's actually going on, economically speaking. So I think it'll probably be in the fourth quarter that we're going to start to really see the effects of these tariffs on the Chinese economy.
The China Daily News says China will emerge stronger after the tariff war with the U.S. Is that because the Chinese historically have endured a lot of painful things?
Well, there is that old story about was it when Nixon went to China and he was asking about the effects of the French Revolution, and at that time, was it Deng or Mao? Was it still Mao? At any rate, the leader at the time replied to him, well, it's too early to tell. And apparently that story is a bit apocryphal, and there was some mistranslation, and apparently they thought they were referring to the 1968 Paris Revolution, not what was happening in 1789 or was it 89? There's something to that. Long-term perspective is what we would expect for the planners behind the Chinese economy. And let's not forget that it is a very planned and controlled economy that is run by a single political party, the Chinese Communist Party. So I think that there is a different political calculus that goes on, a different economic calculus, and I think they do tend to see things in terms of the much larger game plan. And we can see that reflected in the way that both China and Russia really have reacted to the U.S.'s war of terror and its increasing foreign entanglements and quagmire in the Middle East and all of this. I think Russia and China have been content to let the U.S. basically do that, seeing that in the longer term, although they may cause considerable destabilization in the near term, in the longer term, it will actually effectively weaken America's power overall as the unchallenged global superpower. So I think there is a long game being played here. And as I say, in the long term, if China can survive this short-term pain, the longer-term picture is that they will be able to, if they survive that short-term pain, they will be able to transition their economy more towards trading with Eurasia and Europe than the United States. And if that is the long-term game plan, and if they're able to see it through to its completion, then I think ultimately China may come out on top of this. And that's I think the side of this that the U.S. and its short-term political interests are not really calculating here.
We'll have more with James Corbett right after this.
Hi, I'm Douglas Mason, President and CEO of Magnum Gold Corp, MGI and the TSX Venture Exchange. A 2015 drill program on the LH property intersected several high-grade gold intersections, including 11 meters of 20.66 grams per ton gold. Additional drill targets on the LH property have been identified by a 2018 drone airborne magnetic survey to further evaluate a pyrrhotite-enriched gold-bearing system. Please visit our website at magnumgoldcorp.com.
Don't miss out. Stay informed. Receive the HowStreet.com weekly recap with thought-provoking podcasts, radio, and articles delivered to your inbox. Sign up for the HowStreet.com weekly recap on our homepage at HowStreet.com.
Welcome back. We're speaking with James Corbett. James, a new study says that by 2050, society will require double the Earth's available resources. How is Asia going to deal with that?
Well, I remain highly skeptical of studies like that because we have seen studies like that being touted for decades now. In fact, you could go back to the 1970s and the Club of Rome talking about the limits to growth, which made a number of startling predictions about what the world would look like by the year 2000, every single one of which was incorrect, wildly wrong in some cases. And that kind of doom-saying and fear-mongering often sells and is widely taken on board, but is often, in fact, almost entirely 100% incorrect. So I remain highly skeptical about predictions from the year 2018 about what the world's resources situation will look like in 2050, especially as, obviously, technology continues to advance and even our conception of what resources are necessary for industrial society continues to change. Having said that, I think the longer-term picture in Asia is, again, very much centered towards the demographic picture. And obviously China, with its one-child policy for a number of decades, has, in effect, in an interesting way, shot itself in the foot demographically, so that they are now feeling the effects of a type of demographic crunch that is starting to happen, which sounds ridiculous in the world's most populous nation, over 1.3 billion people. But you're starting to see the social effects of that one-child policy playing out in China, where obviously if you could only have one child, most couples would prefer to have a male, a son. So we saw a lot of female abortions and infanticides taking place under that old regime, which has led to a vast discrepancy in the male and female population in China, which is now being felt in the effects of young men trying to find women to marry, and there aren't really enough to go around, as it were. So that this is having knock-on effects that by the year 2050, we're going to see some considerable changes in China, obviously in Japan, where the population crunch has already started and population has already been shrinking for the last couple of years. That, of course, is going to accelerate and intensify. South Korea also facing a dearth of young children. So I think the economic picture for Asia is highly dominated by the demographic picture, and I think that's going to have probably the most important effects. So I guess people can worry about what resources we will or will not have 40 years down the road or 30 years down the road, but I think the question of will there be people around to make use of those resources or not may even be the more pressing question for at least certain parts of this globe.
Could a demographic crunch be behind Amazon's plan to open 3,000 stores that will not have cashiers within the next 2 or 3 years?
I'm not sure it's motivated by the demographic crunch, although that may be one of the factors behind it. But I think this is definitely what we're going to see more of. I mean, this is the inevitable course for retailers generally, and I think Amazon is just wanting to get into that game ahead of the rest of the gang. But I think this is the way that things are going to go. We've already seen 7-Eleven and others doing quick service sandwich making and things like that, push of a button. McDonald's and others, you can order pre-made straight from the computer, essentially. And this is really the future of retailing, like it or not. And that is going to be a significant pain to a lot of the developed Western economies, where service jobs are actually a huge part of the economy at this point. Manufacturing jobs, obviously, having been displaced to Asia. So there is a profound transformation going on right now. And of course, this is why we start seeing the talk of universal basic income and others, because people are really wondering what kinds of jobs will be left once Amazon and others have pioneered the new type of retailing.
Japan is going to have the world's first space tourist. Who is it, and what's behind them?
Yes, a Japanese billionaire whose name is not going to come to mind off the top of my head. He's 42 years old and has made his fame and fortune in clothing retailing here in Japan. And apparently he's registered, or he's bought his way onto the first SpaceX rocket for a 7-day trip around the moon, as early as 2023, although it remains to be seen whether that schedule will be maintained, especially given the craziness surrounding Elon Musk these days. Who knows what's going to happen? But anyway, this Yusaku Maezawa, apparently is his name, will be potentially the first Japanese space tourist on the first SpaceX moon flight. So again, we'll have to see when and if that happens. But it will be a bold new territory for people to pioneer. And I guess if you're a billionaire, you can afford to buy your way onto such a thing.
James, thank you so much for chatting with us.
Thanks for having me on.
My guest has been James Corbett, publisher of thecorbettreport.com. He was speaking to us from Japan. If you have any questions for James or any of our other guests, you can send them to info@howstreet.com. I'm Jim Goddard. Thanks for listening.
Comments made on HowStreet.com radio are an expression of opinion only and should not be construed in any matter whatsoever as recommendations to buy or sell any financial instrument at any time. Available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. HowStreet.com radio is a production of HowStreet Media Incorporated.